Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you here today. I say see you in quotes. We are ready to start today. I'm very excited for today's Lunch and Learn to be able to introduce Karina Ward and Bill Ryan. We're going to be presenting a new tool to measure downtown vitality in mid-sized communities. As you know, if you've been a part of these before, I'll keep an eye on the chat box. If there are any questions you have for Karina and Bill that you don't feel comfortable voicing or you can't voice because an internet connection is wonky or whatever, just type it in the chat box and I'll do that. Otherwise, everyone that comes into the meeting on mute automatically. You're free to unmute your mic if you have a question that you just want to ask too. So just know that you have that power. Looking forward to hearing this. Karina and Bill, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. And welcome,
thanks, Kristen.
everyone. Hey, can we go back to the prior slide for a second? Okay. This is a downtown in Michigan, Ludington, Michigan. And just spend about 10 seconds or 20 seconds and look at this picture closely and see what things are different back in the 1950s and what things are unusual. And jot them down in the text box, and we'll just share those in a few seconds. And Karina or Kristen, can we see the text, the chat box?
Never mind. So far, we have the old cars make it look like photos of Cuba. The cars are beasts from our car aficionado. There are fewer power lines than I would expect. I'm sure other comments will start rolling in.
Okay. I can add one about this picture. This is from a postcard. And back in the 1950s and 60s, whenever you went into a drugstore, there was a postcard rack spinning around with usually pictures of downtown, of your downtown and other downtowns in the region. So it was really kind of a highlight of celebrating your town through a postcard, sending those postcards back to your friends and relatives back home. Anyone else have any comments about this picture?
So no people, all local businesses, no street trees, awnings. Great observations here.
I don't see any building slipcovers, do you? This is before people tried to hide the historic architecture of their buildings in the 60s. Anyway, let's move on, just to kind of get this thinking about the past in our downtowns. And some of us may not have remembered downtowns like this. You know, at the urging of a respected colleague, I agreed to do some applied research in 1919 as well. I had this idea of looking at downtown across the Midwest and use data to predict its vitality. And the thought was using Esri data for demographics and their companion data set on business points throughout the Midwest of individual businesses from a firm called Info USA. And again, the thought was, let's take this data, plot out the downtowns of every downtown in the Midwest of this population range, 25 to 75,000, and then analyze what are the characteristics of those communities. And do certain ones exceed other communities and indicate that there's some chemistry there that leads to vitality in a downtown. So I thought I would surround myself with great talent who could make up for my lack of a PhD. And so I have Steve Deller here, and Kristen, you probably jumped in a little bit, and Matt, I'm sure you jumped in, and Tessa, as well as Michael Biriardi, who's a professor in urban planning at Ball State University. And right away, he was kind of shot down by everyone. So I learned that there's quite a lot of rigor behind getting a PhD and defending your research. So this became more of an extension reference paper to help communities look at their community and identify other places in the Midwest that are similar to theirs in terms of demographics and business activity. And even with that, there were all kinds of caveats that were put on the table by these talented critiques or peers. One being the word vitality. Can we define vitality through the measurement of data, or is there something else to vitality that that needs to be in place? So, you know, without a budget, we assembled this group of PhD students, PhDs, and some students at both institutions And we worked on this paper, which we're going to talk about in a few seconds. But listening to everyone's feedback, we got rid of the word vitality from the title. And with Kristen, if you don't mind, we're changing the title now to what you have in front of you, Downtown Business Mix Analysis of Midwest Cities with populations between 25,000 and 75,000. Okay, and I'll tell you what this is going to be used for in a few seconds. It was a learning effort for me that we knew I should have done better in my statistics class in college. Really couldn't keep up with these smart people around me. So we're not promising any magical formulas with this paper that's going to determine what you need to do to have a vibrant community. But we're simply going to examine these medium-sized downtowns across the Midwest and develop a resource paper that can be used for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about in a second. So some of the uses of the analysis: what types of businesses and services are located in downtowns today? So comparing that picture from 1950s we just looked at, how does that compare to downtowns today in terms of business mix? What are suburban and independent cities and how their downtowns are different? We use the word independent to define places that are not suburban, that are not contiguous to a major metropolitan area or a smaller metropolitan area for that matter, but are really independent. They're typically the county seats, and they have a very different profile of downtowns than suburban towns. The third point we're going to work for in this analysis is which downtowns have a dense mix of businesses, employment, and residents. Now, until about a month ago, density and building up were the common ingredients among many downtown plans. Now things may be changing a little bit with the pandemic that we're facing. And then the last one here, we have all this interesting data set of all these centroids, these points that identify the exact downtown of every one of these cities in the Midwest. And the question is, how can we further use that to look at spatially downtowns and their activity levels, and what specific questions can we answer from this, whether it be COVID or something else. We'll talk about some of that in a few minutes. So the agenda then for today, for this next 50 minutes, is talking about the evolution of downtown's business mix. Karina is going to talk about the methodology and the data that we used, and the independent versus suburban downtowns that make up our mix of communities. And I'm going to talk about downtown functions. We heard of the live, work, play type stuff that we've been talking about for years. And we're kind of divide the cities in the Midwest into these different function areas. And then some general observations that we found from the data. And again, this is just a start. I think we've developed a structure upon which to merge geographic locations of these downtowns with other sources of data from on the map and other places that can tell us and answer questions that we have about our downtown and its place in the Midwest. So the next picture is downtown Janesville. And this is, oh gee, anyone have a guess what year this would be? It'd be before the car. Maybe 1910 or 1900 maybe, I'm not sure. But it looked like a pretty active town at the time. Downtowns have changed a lot in the past 100 years, of course. And the best thing to do for now is to go through this section without spending too much time, is to build a timeline for downtowns. So we're going to do some interactive stuff here with you for a second. And you know what happened last night? Karina was walking out her building and she dropped the PowerPoint deck. And she messed up everything for our presentation today. And so what we're going to have to do is rebuild her work that she put together. So in her PowerPoint deck, she had this listing of dates of decades, 1920s, 30s, 40s. And some are filled in. Those pieces were not lost on the stairwell. But others are empty. So we got to figure out what was in those empty spots. And I guess we can do this by voice, don't you think? We have too many people for that, do you think, Kristen? Or
I think that sounds like a great idea.
okay, so you can unmute yourself when you want to talk. And well, the first one she lost, I'm going to blame this on her all day long, is the 1920s. What was happening in the 1920s?
Autos.
Autos?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Speakeasies.
Speakeasy.
Prohibition, yeah.
The introduction of the zoning code.
Ah, okay.
Influenza pandemic prior to that.
1917, you're right. Good thinking. Anyone else?
The radio.
Radio.
The Garden City movement was just starting to enter the upper eastern seaboard, your hometown neck of the woods.
That's a planner talking right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone
Should we
else?
show them what we had, Bill?
Yeah, go ahead, Karina.
Okay.
Retail chains were popping up in downtowns using sophisticated site selection tools, which businesses deemed unfair. Small businesses, individual businesses. Same thing that's been happening in the past 50 years. Is that at that time, Woolworths and A&S, A&P, were all knocking on the door with all kinds of fancy models saying, this is a town, this is 100% corner we want to be at in our downtown. So this is not the exact answer, but it's one of the answers. You guys already contributed some better answers, so thank you. 1950s, what happened back then? What milestones did we face back in the 50s?
The Housing Act of 1949, developing mortgage insurance and public housing, slum removal. This is where you have the Institute of Transportation Engineers having a direct influence and collaborating with the National Housing Act and FHA to really start creating the urban forms we have today.
I also
Does
think
that
the
also
rise.
have involved redlining?
Absolutely.
Todd,
I
are
also
you
think-
working on a class by chance?
You bet I am. And,
Oh, boy.
and the
That's a-
Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 and how it didn't apply equally to depending on the pigmentation of your skin and how that affected your access to some of these other benefits and quality of life.
But we had the rise of the middle class at that particular in the 50s,
We had the
and with
invention of it,
a lot more disposable income than probably of general people than the and other decades had seen.
Right.
was-
The highest marginal tax rate exceeding 90%.
Yeah,
I think Kathleen Haas is also right.
Well, you guys are
Baby
smart.
boom. Kathleen Haas wrote Baby Boom. I would
Mhm.
say the rise of teenage culture for the first time, a culture that's separate and distinct from that of their parents.
Yeah.
You
Didn't
get
I mention
the Highway Act as well.
Robert Moses?
Robert Moses goes to war with Jane Jacobs, and the rest is history.
Yeah. How about, did someone mention the lunch counters at Woolworths and the other 5 and dimes? The protests? Yeah, it was a big milestone, a big situation back in the 50s.
It was the start of a discussion.
Started the civil rights movement. Yeah.
Yeah.
For
That
shopping
sounds
centers,
pretty
rise of the
similar.
automobile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we're almost done cleaning up our mess here. So 1990s, what was known here in the 1990s as being a milestone for downtown? Or
Nirvana.
this is an easy one. We spent
Shifting
Pearl
away
Jam,
from
but-
retail to services.
back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
The rise of the big box retailers.
Walmart.
Internet.
Ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding. You're all right. And then we get into the 2010s.
Hey, Todd, what happened in the 2010s with planning?
I don't know. I was busy doing comp planning and trying to get into extension, and so I wasn't paying attention to the real world. I was paying attention to my world.
Would internet fall into that equation?
Yeah.
yeah, that's the point where you really had Amazon and those. I mean, they were existed earlier, but they became dominant players.
Yeah, I think some of the concepts that we also heard from the 1910s, the 2010s was the walkability concepts, livability downtown.
Oh yeah, that creeped in the 1970s and then really started taking a strong hold. You start seeing your downtown revitalization movements in the 70s and 80s starting to take off when everything else was going shitty. And then and then some of the more walkability and transit-oriented design stuff starts peaking out in the mid to late 80s and going into the early 90s, and that's when you get the Congress of New Urbanism and LEED and complete streets and a bunch of these other things that start happening on the coast, but then we don't start recognizing it in the Midwest till much later. And then smart growth, and then we get Wisconsin catching up and actually kind of doing, in some ways, leading the way with smart growth.
Wow. Todd the Textbook Johnson. It's your new name.
I'm surrounded by books right now in my basement.
Good job, Todd.
Oh, finally I have a purpose.
All right.
Next slide.
Yeah.
Hey, Karina,
Okay. Yes.
I cleaned up your mess, so you now have to
Oh.
clean up my mess.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Well, thank you all for your contributions there. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we actually did as part of this. So as Bill mentioned, we looked at municipalities with populations between 25 and 75,000 in 7 Midwestern states. So Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. We then identified downtown locations, and we did that through GIS using density and clustering of businesses. There was a, we then kind of went through and did a on-the-ground check looking through to make sure that it was actually picking up downtown areas, and it did a very good job of doing that for us. We defined our downtown area as a half-mile radius around that center point. This is based on standard walking distance. A half mile is about 5 blocks, which is typically what people are willing to walk. We really did this knowing that every downtown is different, but we needed to have a consistent measure and have something that, while it doesn't fit all downtowns, would be consistent throughout. We use data from 3 different sources as part of this. So we had data from the Census Bureau, InfoUSA, and Esri, and we used that data to analyze the type of businesses and their business functions within downtowns. So the caveat and the limitation is that all of these data sources have their own limitations, and when we put them together, that can be kind of compounded. Now, especially with InfoUSA, the records from that do not reflect recent openings and closings of businesses. And when you're using that information within a specific location, there can be additional problems. But because we were looking at a broad spectrum, we felt comfortable using that information for comparison informations. One other thing to note is that we are using this information on the number of businesses. It does not account for the size. And so a general merchandise store could be a corner mom and pop. It could also be a Walmart. So those are considered equal, and there is not a way for us to account for that in the analysis. So that's just another limitation or thing to keep in mind about the data that we used. This is the location of all of our study cities. There were a total of 259 of them. Here, hold on. Whoops. Give me 1 second. I need to move something off my screen. There we go. So what this does, this shows the smaller cities are in red. We had 189 of those. So those again are the 25 to 50,000. And then our larger cities were the 50 to 75, and we had 70 of those. What stands out immediately from this spatially is that cluster around Chicago and the Twin Cities. And a lot of these are kind of the more suburban communities, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is an example of one of our defined downtown areas. We picked this one because it shows kind of the limitation of using our defined rings. So this is Stevens Point. And as you'll see, and as most of you know, the Wisconsin River creates a natural barrier here. And so those businesses are primarily on one side of that shore, and they continue off in that direction. So we're not picking up what might be considered all of downtown here. And we also see up to the northeast of downtown, we've got a strip of businesses that continue along that arterial street. So this kind of shows the difficulties related to using a ring to represent it. So that's why we're showing it. But again, the intent of using the ring is that we needed a standard upon which to gauge business mix in all of our communities. And this really is more of an exception, which is why we wanted to show it to you guys. All right, so the next kind of definition to share with you guys. So our next step is that we defined each of our cities either as an independent or a suburban. So an independent city is when it's not contiguous to another or larger urbanized area. These tended to be a primary retail destination. They were often county seats or a center of government, healthcare, or education. A suburban city is just that. It's contiguous to a larger urbanized area. Now, these are influenced by those demographics, the availability of larger commercial areas and real estate development. So some of these have very few businesses. They really serve as a residential center instead of economic center. So as you can see here on the slide, a lot of our cities that we picked up were suburban communities within that smaller size range. We did have quite a few within the other categories as well. So this just kind of shows you how those were distributed. As far as results, so what you're seeing now, this is by type of business. This is the median number of downtown businesses by by city type and by size. So the first set of columns is for the independent cities and the second set is for the suburban cities. So kind of just at a quick glance, what we notice here and what we're showing this to you is to show that there's a lot more variety to our downtown businesses than just retail and restaurants. When we talk about downtowns, a lot of time what people think about is retail and restaurants, but there's a lot more going on there. Another thing that really stands out is that we have more activity happening in our independent cities than our suburban cities. The numbers are the median number of downtown businesses are higher in every category for the independents than the suburbans. And as I mentioned before, part of this is probably due to the fact that these suburban downtowns are typically constructed for residential purposes. A lot of the time they are around a commuter rail station, especially in the Chicago area. And it may also just be because there's already an abundance of commercial space along the arterial highways in these communities. It's just not located in their downtown areas.
Karina,
yes.
we had a question in the chat box. For independent, does that also mean it's not part of an MSA, or is there overlap in independent?
That is a good question. And I'm trying to think of it. I am not sure. I would have to go back and look to make sure.
Yeah, they can be MSAs as long as they meet the threshold of the MSA, which is based on the city population as well as the contiguous urbanized areas. But
Thank you.
like Kankakee is a good example of
There you go.
independent city.
Yeah, they could fall within the area. Yes, thank you for that. So I'm highlighting some of the things that stand out especially. So for example, retail trade is high across the board, so is finance and insurance. Professional, scientific, and tech service is high across the board, so is healthcare. Food service and drinking establishments are high across the board. So this other service, excluding public administration, I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up. That is just, it's a bucket for everything that you could think of. So it includes everything from equipment and machinery repairs to religious activities, personal care, pet care, and dating services. So it's really it's all kinds of things. It could be anything, quite honestly. So it's really just the other bucket of things that didn't fit. But the thing that really stands out on this is the public administration is very much higher in independent cities, but that again makes sense considering that our independent cities tend to be centers of government as opposed to our suburban cities where they don't have a need for those services. Breaking down the retail trade a little bit farther by type, what you see here is just kind of the variety of types of retail that our communities have. I'm going to call your attention to a couple things. So clothing and accessory shops, sports, hobby, business, and music, and then miscellaneous store retailers are much higher in our independent cities than our suburban cities. So those are just a couple things of note for that. So before I move on to our next little interactive activity, does anyone have any questions about all of this data that I just put in front of you? Because I know that was a lot of numbers and kind of flying through real fast. Okay.
An interesting thing I found in some cities, they have enacted zoning laws that require that any downtown business, retail business, has to be under 5,000 square feet. And that at the same time, suburban type businesses in the city limits cannot be less than 5,000 square feet. And what that is doing is encouraging people, that the mom and pop shop owner or business owner, to set up shop in downtown as opposed to the edge of town, because they don't meet the 5,000 square foot threshold. So,
Yeah.
Did you look at all at parking policy in differences?
no, we didn't. That's a good point.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Yeah, I think it's really interesting how just looking at the numbers, unless you dig into the policies behind, so the zoning and the parking, there's a lot of layers underneath this that really lead to the decisions that are made about business location.
Yeah, I just think that the more I'm walking around the planet, I guess, the more I see how parking policy, especially the differences between a suburban and an independent city, might have a dramatic impact on the number of businesses that can locate in a particular location because of parking requirements. It would separate those uses and spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Good
no,
point, good
that's a
point.
great point. Okay.
Okay, wake up everyone, time for exercise.
So we started our presentation looking at a photo of Ludington, Michigan from 1950. So moving to today, the question is, what makes a great downtown? So we are encouraging everyone to use the annotation tool, which should be either at the top of your screen, it should say annotate, or it's at the bottom. It depends on how your menu is set up. And you can use that to type a few words on anywhere in the white space that describe a great downtown.
And that was me trying to find my annotation tool.
Yeah,
Apologies.
Annotation tool, where the heck could that be?
Yeah, where is it?
On mine, it's at the top, and it says annotate. I don't know where it is for
Someone got it there with blue.
It'll say like more tools, and it'll
Check under
bring it up.
view options at
Look.
the top.
View, it's under view options on the top.
There we go.
Annotate. Text.
I don't see hash browns on this list yet, Todd. There we go. For those who are not part of the community vitality and placemaking signature effort, hash browns is one of the requirements for any visit that the team does. We find hash browns because we deem that as an important test or important way to try out a community, is to find hash browns at a local diner.
Why not grits?
Because this is Wisconsin and grits are harder to find than hash browns.
Oh, okay.
And I'll go out on a limb and say they don't always taste very good.
Grits don't taste good?
No.
Oh, you're a communist.
Yeah. These are great. Yeah, awesome. Kristen, are we getting some in the chat box too? I can't see that right now.
We have fun stuff, walkability, parks. Pat Malone says grits don't taste. Part of the issue. Part of the issue with grits.
Okay. No, these are fantastic. Wow. We'll give people about another minute, I would say, to put things up here. And then Kristen, if you can do a screenshot of this before we move on, that would be great.
All right, I've got the screenshot.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
We'll put this together, but it looks like it's a combination of things that represent a mixed-use downtown with a focus on the public and public spaces.
Yeah, there's a lot of great things here.
And building on local resources, natural resources, walkability in parks, and yeah, a lot of good ideas here.
Yeah. Including some comments about hash browns and grits. So,
Yeah. Okay, next slide.
Just a second. I see on there metered parking. I'm looking elsewhere for, maybe I'm missing it, but just parking in general, convenient parking.
And this is really important when you look at a bigger town that has need to accommodate office workers and downtown residents at night, where they can share parking garages and that kind of thing. So
yeah, well, and even for visitors, I mean, I look at people coming in. If I don't feel like I'm going to find a place to park, I'm not going there.
No.
Because I'm 60 miles out. I mean, looking at the trade area that they draw from, not just the downtown itself.
Yeah, some of the really interesting things that Vancouver, BC was doing, like back in the 70s and 80s, was trying to get rid of cars in general, and then Portland sort of copied them. And then it was around the 2000s that Vancouver said, well, we need cars. And so now their whole system of planning is developed around being able to accommodate multimodal transportation, but always emphasizing the pedestrian.
There's another angle that might put on the parking lot to think about is bypass highways that go around these. There's a Wisconsin DOT study that looked at the economic impact of bypass highways, and the perception is that these things are going to kill downtowns. But in reality, they help because they take a lot of unnecessary traffic out of the downtown, particularly semi-trucks and large trucks. So that might be another angle to kind of look at here. The argument is that if there's semi-trucks and whatnot going through the downtown, I don't feel safe walking around. It's not a pleasant environment. If you take that kind of traffic out, it makes the downtown a little bit quieter and more pleasant to visit.
Right. Yeah.
Steve, can you share that study? I would love to have that in my back pocket.
I'm sure I've got it, but I'm also sure that my filing system has failed me, but I'll look for it.
All right, thanks, man.
And an example of a community that addressed that issue over time and has had some success with that has been Dubuque, because everything went on streets. I mean, what you would consider regular streets in Dubuque until they did the their bypasses.
Well, let's jump ahead and look at downtown functions and using the data that we've assembled. There are the common categories of downtown as a place to work, to live, to shop, to dine, could be answered using the data that we've collected. So, for example, under work, what we've done here for each of these 260 cities and communities in the Midwest, we calculated the percentage of a city's employment that worked downtown. So if 10% of the employees in the city work downtown, it would be 10% in that column. Living, we did the same thing. We looked at the total city population and determined the percentage of those people that live downtown. And shopping, we used the raw number of retail stores. And dining, we looked at the hospitality industry's lodging and food service category and calculated the number of employees per city resident that are employed downtown. So each of these is kind of a measure of activity in the work, live, shop, and dine categories. There's also an overall left-hand column here that overall measure of downtown's percentage of city businesses in total. It's not as precise as the other 4 columns, but for quick overall benchmark. Now, with these formulas in place, the overall work, live, shop, and dine calculations, we ran those for every one of the 260 cities in the Midwest in our database. And we came up with some interesting findings. One call came in before the data was released from a angry council person in Port Huron, Michigan, saying that our downtown's falling apart. How can it be high on your list, you know? And then the rest of the town kind of turned on this guy and said, "This is our town. We're proud of it. We're proud of the work we've done. The new housing downtown and restaurants." And so it's kind of a sore subject for the community, in that this one guy kind of put up a stink about their ranking. But anyway, I learned from that experience that I don't do rankings anymore, because you just get yourself in trouble. So what we have in the next page, next slide, is a ranking, but only you guys know about this. It's the top 10, top 15 communities in each of these categories in the Midwest. And I think if we hit the enter button, we can highlight some of those that are in Wisconsin. And you look at Superior in the first column, and that surprises me. You know, why are there more businesses in downtown Superior as a percentage than in other cities in the state? And I looked at that, and there certainly are a number of individual businesses that might be related to the oil station there, the oil pumping station there, or other industries, not just retail. But Appleton came up in the second column as a place to work. It came up very high. Again, this list looks like it's low in the list, but this is the top 15 or so of 250 communities. So Appleton wins a prize here. No one in terms of downtown population concentration, the third column from Wisconsin. Fourth column, shop. Greenfield, Wisconsin came in near the top. I said, what the heck? Where's Greenfield? Never been there before. And yeah, I've been through there many times going to the airport. It's a suburban stretch, I guess. Karina, am I correct in describing it that way? With a Best Buy and a lot of, so it's not really a downtown. So it was one of our little errors in our geocoding of downtowns, I guess. But Wausau came up really high in the retail category, and Appleton and Waukesha. And then dining, we came up with some winners here. If I call them winners, La Crosse is very well known for their hospitality and hotels and restaurants. So they came up pretty high on the list. But this is just a quick snapshot, and these happen to be in the order that they were calculated. Many of these places are college towns, which have a unique captured audience that allow them to have restaurants and hotels and some retail and a lot of employment. But these towns that we've highlighted in red are kind of unique, all-American Wisconsin towns for the most part. So, so I guess I wouldn't take this home and put a press release out in a paper on this, but it certainly could be used as a benchmarking tool to look at your community versus other places that are also high performing. The report that that has all this in it is in my stack here. You can Google this thing. Maybe Karina, you're going to get to this in a second, but there's a table in the back of this report that has all the cities in the Midwest and their comparison data. There's also a companion report for smaller communities, those of 2,500 to 25,000 population, that our grad student, John Wilstrath, put together. And it addresses more closely the rural areas of Wisconsin. So that's available as well. If you Google to our website or just Google downtown economic development, you should find it. Next slide.
Bill, do we want to talk about some of the ways that we can use this data before we move on?
Yeah, it means you're saying, Bill, go find your notes. Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Well, in addition to finding peer communities, part of the market analysis process is to visit different places that have a vibrant downtown and look at places that are similar to your town So if you're Kent, Ohio, you might want to look at West Lafayette, Indiana as another college town with similar characteristics. And the purpose of these visits is to kind of like first impressions, um, to get a sense of what's going on there, how the people get along with between the chamber and the city hall and the bid, and pull away some hints that could be applied to your community. So it's one, looking at case studies, and two, there's also some ability here to use this information to as it relates to COVID. For example, looking at residential density downtown, and if that is some way related to a hotspot of activity with the virus in your town, or is your town too dependent on restaurants and hotels? Karina showed that earlier slide that showed the different types of industries in those towns. And we hear a lot about the starving restaurant and may not be able to reopen again, but there are a lot of other businesses in downtowns that this analysis could identify that are also at risk of not opening up again. So, and then the third example, I just finished a paper for, we submitted to the IEDC journal. And my colleague, David Milder in New York, who's one of the 3 PhDs that I had working in the study with me, he did most of the writing, I did most of the data crunching for him. But it's basically a paper to question the notion that the more people that live and work in downtown also attract more people that just reside downtown by making it a place for living and working. That sends a signal to other people that this is a good place to set up our home, or at least for a while. And he has used our data here to look at the Midwestern cities of 25 to 75,000 to make that argument that places that have both a high percentage of living and working downtown also attract a lot of people as residents. So those are three areas where we can use this this material, and I'm sure there are many other items, other applications that that you guys could help us, or we can help you explore. Observations. Oh boy, this is just the start of what we're finding here. Some of the quick things that came across from our analysis, and I think I'm doing the odd ones, right, Karina?
Yes.
Okay. The traditional threshold approach that Steve and I used to work on long ago was looking at the number of businesses that could be supported by a community of a certain population. And in a way, this is kind of the same thing. We're looking at the number of businesses that can operate in a suburban town of 25 to 50,000 people. But as we looked at the data, the number of businesses don't really have that much to do with population as we thought it did. It has to do with other factors, if it's a county seat, if it's a college town, or whatever it might be. But the notion that because a town is bigger than, town A is bigger than town B, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be more of a retail hub than town B.
I mentioned earlier, we also found that independent cities have significantly more businesses downtown than suburban cities. And again, this can simply be because suburban downtowns were constructed for residential purposes, or because our suburban cities tend to have their commercial areas spread along arterials instead of downtowns, but that's something else that we found.
Yep, good point. And if you're working in downtown Chicago, you may do some purchasing downtown in Chicago instead of doing it in Geneva, Illinois. Number 3 on the list here. It says, not all cities have downtowns. Well, we found that out in Greenville. And there's another new town center in around Detroit and Cleveland that also came up in our list as downtowns, but they're new created suburbs that look like Hilldale Mall, town center type shopping centers. Suburban downtowns also typically have a smaller central business district, is what we found. And by the way, these nodes that identify the downtowns, they were actually created by a student from Iraq who worked with our colleague in Ball State, Michael. And he went through and developed some kind of script that would allow us to look at the concentration of businesses. And then he would recheck those concentrations to see if they made sense as the logical historical downtown based on street grid design and all. And one thing I learned about research from him is that he said, well, you can't go through all 280 towns on the map and make sure I did it right. just do a random sample of the communities that you analyzed and see how those are doing. And I did that, and the numbers were right on. This guy was a brilliant contributor to this work.
Yeah. Something else is that low-scoring downtowns are not necessarily bad places to live. They're just not commercial centers. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that just because something didn't score highly on this list doesn't mean it's not a negative thing in any way, shape, or form. It just means that it's not a commercial center, because that's what we were measuring. We were measuring the concentration of commercial business.
And number 5 of our observations is high-scoring downtowns often included colleges and universities. Ames, Iowa came up high, and Kent, Ohio, and Worcester, Ohio. It's the magic of the people in college towns and returning alumni and parents that make those places capture a lot of dollars, and they have, as a result, pretty decent downtowns throughout the country.
Yeah, and then finally, changes in retail, including the decline in the shopping mall and increase in e-commerce, and COVID-19, what we're going through right now, is going to continue to challenge cities searching for the optimal business mix. So
yeah.
Those were our observations. So the next steps are really, how could this be useful in your community? As Bill mentioned, the full report is available online, as well as that companion report that John did as part of his graduate work, and we are both available to talk about any use that you guys see in your community. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see faces instead of just my presentation. But yeah, we'd love to open it up and have some conversation about how you guys think this might be useful for you.
Bill, this is Brandon, and Karina, this is Brandon. I'm curious, did you look at any other data points? So that it was that number 4 point that you had on there about independence and low scoring. I'm just curious about, I suspect that the farther you are from a major metropolitan area, there's sort of a threshold at which you just sort of you're losing population and economic activity. Again, that's just a hunch. I don't know that for sure, but did you look at any other data like distance from metro or industry type that maybe dominates those areas, or things like household income?
Well, not in a comprehensive way. I did notice a number of examples of remote towns that are in rural areas that are holding their own and doing well because they're still a trade center for a large region. Like right under Wisconsin, for example, although it's not part of this report, it's a smaller community. They have a vibrant community of retail because they serve a huge trade area, probably the biggest trade area in Wisconsin, because there's nothing further north that compares. So in terms of the urban, suburban type centers, Karina, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that?
I was just going to say, I think that falls into the, like, now that we have all of these communities identified and we like have the geographic information for them and we have this data set, that is definitely something that we could look at. We did not, we have not yet. But now that we have like the base level of information, we could certainly start pulling in different sets of data to compare. So we could look at something. So
on top of the data, one thing I learned, another lesson I learned from my colleagues is that you have to have a manageable database too. This thing that we had was about, it went out to XYZ 3000, and it was a huge monster, and we couldn't find the right fields that we wanted to use half the time. So in my attempt to not throw anything out, I developed a spreadsheet that was too big to use. Sharon's laughing.
I want to ask you guys a question, especially in light of the situation we're in right now, but also based on, Bill, you're familiar with all the market analysis we're doing. Do you see downtowns moving away, or business districts moving away from trying to get this commercial entertainment mix and moving towards something else, like trying to attract visitors for recreational purposes or for convening, for more community building purposes? Or is this mix of having all sorts of different sectors really critical to keeping the downtown vibrant? What's your predictions, in other words?
Karina, you want to go first?
See, and I'm still firmly in the camp of it is too early for us to know, because we just don't know yet how far things are going to go. Does that, if that makes sense? Yeah, I'm not ready to make predictions like that yet. I mean, I'm never really ready to make that kind of a prediction, but I'm not sure how far spread this is going to be, and how, it's more so I'm not sure how our communities are going to react to it, as far as how long it's going to take for entertainment and such to recover and what that will look like. I don't know that we will ever get back to full movie theaters again.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this, you have to realize that what drives a lot of this are people's preferences, taste and preferences, and they change over time. I can remember when Bill started working with me on this very early on, we were using a lot of the suburbs of Chicago as a counterpoint, because that's where I grew up. And when I grew up, living in the suburbs was the American goal. And now it's kind of turned itself on the head, and it's not living in the suburbs anymore. It's living in urban centers. You see that with Madison. 10 years from now, it could shift. It could be that people don't want to live in urban centers anymore. They want to live out in the rural communities. So these things are kind of waves, and a lot of what drives the waves is how people they change how they want to live and work. Is it generational? It might be generational, but it's really kind of hard to forecast long term. You know, what are our children? What are they going to want? It's really difficult to forecast that and predict that.
Although I think that the value of downtown will always be there, because from a real estate perspective, it's the central location in the community, and it's the gathering place in the community. And this pandemic, when it's wearing itself out, people are going to still want to get together, and you just can't change the nature of people. And we'll have safety guards in place, but so the fact that downtown will always be a central social place. It may not be a retail place anymore, but it's a place of services, a place of dining, places of gathering. Will be its return, and because of its location, it'll be a healthy return.
Bill, I really appreciate that last comment, in that even without COVID-19, retail has been changing a lot, and consumer interaction with retail establishments and moving toward online. So thinking of it more as a gathering place, as that social entity is, or an organism, an entity that keeps social connections, kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm going to add one thing, and then I see that Alfonso raised his hand. So as far as like the entertainment space, I think people are going to continue to seek experiences. It's just a matter of what that looks like. I think that's going to be the shift. So people are going to continue to want and seek an experience, whether that looks the same as an art gallery or a museum, the way that we have things right now, or if that shifts. I think that's the unknown that we're still kind of waiting to see how that shifts. And I agree with you, Steve Deller. It feels weird to call you Steve. I agree with you, Deller. Like it's based on preferences of what people are going to decide that they feel comfortable with, and we just don't know yet. So Alfonso, do you?
Sure, I have many questions, but I guess the first one is to just review for me again what you've been up to. And before I say that, I just want to say one of the main reasons I logged on was just to look at Bill's face for a while. So Bill, it's really good to see you, even though you can't see me because I'm stirring around over here. And
you're a good guy, Alfonso.
the video's no good, but yeah, it's just good to see you.
Thank you.
You bet. So what were we all up to here? I mean, what is? I see the utility of a humongous spreadsheet, right? Just on its face, there's utility in a big old data set. But if I understand correctly, you were interested in answering the question: how much in is there a difference between independent and suburban cities in terms of commercial activity in the central business district or whatever, the small downtown? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're on target here. We're actually trying to identify other uses for this, but its primary use is halfway through the process was developing a tool that you can use to help identify other places that are doing really well that you can build upon their best practices.
Yeah. So that occurred. So when we had this, when you told me about it many months ago, Bill, I thought, so I was attracted to the idea of a big data set that could do that, you might say. Now, the question then is, what is it that constitutes best practice? So, or to put it differently, let me see if I can get my question out right here. So from the perspective of the folks in the downtown, they're trying to maintain a vibrant community.
Right.
Not necessarily a vibrant downtown, but a vibrant community all the way around. So, and they've got their different vehicles for that, given their context. You know, in a more agricultural setting, it's going to look like one set of things. In a less agricultural setting that may be dominated by, I don't know how big Ripon is. It's probably not 25,000 people, but Ripon, right? Ripon, Wisconsin, right?
Yep.
Or Rhinelander, like you said, 10,000 people. So not in your data set, but substantial activity.
Right.
So how is it that people in their particular context, how will they use this? I know that's what you're asking, but so I'm sorry, I'm just going around in circles. Let me say something. Let me say something different.
Okay.
So if you go to, while you were talking, I went ahead and Googled best small cities in Wisconsin, and that took me to best small cities in Wisconsin in America. And the big difference between their data and yours is that they stop first. They make a normative judgment.
Right.
Okay, best. Second, they go from 25,000 to 100,000. Third, they don't use your central measure.
Right.
I suspect though, if you threw out your central measure, or if they adopted your central measure of downtown, my quick look at their report says that there's some overlap between your table of 7 slides ago and their table. You
Right.
see what I mean?
Originally, Alfonso, what we had intended on doing was gathering all these rankings that you see on MSN, best downtowns in the country, this and that, and put them side by side and see how many of those relate to our data. But I was cautioned by my colleagues that that's you're dealing with apples and oranges. You're dealing with real data, and then you're dealing with opinions and popularity. And so we dumped that idea at that point because it would one broken link in the chain of reliable data would doom the whole project. So.
So I get that, but I think that I just looked at the methodology associated with the report I just discussed, and it was put together by a few PhDs as well. And
same ones, right?
Not the same ones, but some urban planners and some this and that.
Yeah.
And I'm, so I think that by and large, I think the caution is always warranted. That caution is always warranted. That correction is always welcome. It should always be welcome. But I think that you may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater on this one. So, I wouldn't know which ones, unless you actually do the work of seeing which ones feel legitimate and decide that. But that's a different project, right? I agree with you that that's a different project.
I like the idea.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, Brian. Yeah.
So a lot of you know my situation up here in Lac du Flambeau. Bill, you've been here, done a lot of work with us over the years and our downtown revitalization projects and stimulating downtown.
Yeah.
But I look at this information in the cities and medium-sized cities, et cetera. So is there information in there that we can condense to a point where when we look at smaller towns, maybe have some similarities, themes, connecting of the dots of information and thoughts on this study? And the other thing I want to throw out there is one of the questions we've always asked from the get-go. This is going way back when Chuck was involved in a lot of the work too, about asking the question to community, where does a downtown begin and end? And, how do you sort of consolidate that or look at that from that perspective? So I know it's a big rounded question, but just
well, the first part of the question, the other study, the companion study written by John, the grad student, who's now an assistant planner in Janesville, is probably what you'd want to look at in Lac du Flambeau, and use the smallest category of 2,500 population communities, and give you a sense of what kind of business mix serves those type of communities. But again, I think a long time ago, Brian, we did an analysis of other tribal business districts, which I think is a lot more appropriate for Lac du Flambeau, where you're looking at apples to apples instead of different types of towns. Where does it begin and where does it end? Well, for this analysis, we just used an arbitrary half-mile ring to capture a standardized geography for each community and compared those. But in reality, every town is going to have a different shape. And if you find one with a circle around it, let me know, because I don't think there are many any downtown districts that really follow any kind of circle like that.
Bill, you had some, not assumptions, but thoughts on what some of this information meant. My question of you and Karina and anybody involved with it is, as you went through this process, you obviously, everybody walks in with certain preconceived notions. What did you find out that was different from your what surprised you? And what did you look for and go, why isn't this here? When we expect certain things of a downtown.
Yeah. Well, a few things I was surprised at, and Karina, jump in here. But one is the erratic data that we're working with, that other businesses, other companies around the country are using on a daily basis. Not to speak bad about Esri or about Info USA, but there are errors in those data. And so that was a little bit of a disappointment. The other thing is I was surprised that the common thought I had for many years is that the bigger the town, the more businesses they're going to have. And that was shot down by looking at the comparison of suburban towns versus independent cities, where there are more people, more companies in these suburban towns, in the independent towns, than there are in the cities, suburban areas. So that was kind of a surprise. It kind of turned the threshold analysis upside down, in that it's not always dependent upon population.
I would say that's what surprised me the most too, was that for a lot of the business types, that is not the case.
Yeah.
That you can more than double the population size and the number of businesses, and that type stays the same.
Yeah. And then there's surprises in the ranking. I'm surprised that Wisconsin didn't have nearly as many communities rise up in this list as did Illinois or even Michigan. Not that we're doing poorly, but we don't have the top performers like some of these other states offer. So it's all kinds of, but you know, one takeaway, if I could share one takeaway, although one of the primary purposes of this data is to help Wausau or La Crosse or Stevens Point look for comparable communities in the Midwest. The one thing I'm walking away with is that there is no such thing as a comparable community. Every community is different, and the important thing is that they build upon their assets, whether it be natural resources or whether it be a certain anchor business or university. Build upon what they have, and don't look at the town down the street as a comparable, because they have different assets than you. So
the other thing that jumped out at me really quickly was that professional technical services category. There are some categories of businesses that you generally don't think of locating downtown. So the backbone of the downtown is not retail restaurants anymore. It's professional and personal services.
Yeah.
I mean, those just really jump out. And that was kind of I kind of knew that, but I didn't know it until this data came out.
Yeah. That's a good point, Steve.
And I'll note that I lost track of time because I was interested in reading the chat and everything. It is actually 1:07. And anyone who is interested in continuing to discuss this, please feel free to stay on, and I'll keep this open as long as possible. But for those of you that have other meetings you need to go to, we are past 1 o'clock. Yeah. So with that, what other discussion do we have? And I will pause the recording now too, actually.